Okay, we are live. We are on Facebook and benvenuti a tutto il pubblico, benvenuti questa serata di Galastica, la prima delle 4 serate che faremo connessi online con i nostri ospiti. Questa sera è un grandissimo onore avere con noi Anna Fisher, una delle astronaute più famose degli Stati Uniti e della NASA. Faremo un'ora di presentazione in cui Anna Fisher ci racconterà la sua storia e poi potremo seguire con le domande. È come dire un grande onore per Galastica avere un ospite di eccezione come Anna Fisher, è sicuramente una delle occasioni che ci dà diciamo così, che ci dà il Covid, cioè quella di avere la possibilità di ospitare delle personalità che arrivano anche da oltreoceano. Se l'avessimo fatta in presenza probabilmente non saremmo riusciti ad avere queste partecipazioni. Nelle prossime serate avremo infatti altri ospiti, quindi io con tantissimo piacere lascio la parola a Marlene Monfiletto Nice, un cognome particolare, che è vice addetto culturale all'ambasciata americana e che ci aiuterà a interloquire con la dottoressa Fisher e che ci accompagnerà in questo nostro percorso. Dottoressa Nice, benvenuta, è davvero un onore avere anche lei qui in Italia, grazie mille, le lascio la parola e poi per qualsiasi cosa mi chieda.
Grazie mille Molisella. L'ambasciata americana è lieta di collaborare con la tua organizzazione per la Galastica Astronomy Festival. E adesso parlerò in inglese per presentarvi l'ospite speciale per stanotte. Dr. Anna Fisher is one of the first female astronauts selected by NASA. In fact, she was called the first mother in space. Dr. Fisher worked on the Space Shuttle program, the International Space Station, and the Orion capsule being developed by NASA's Future Space Launch System. Additionally, she was a crew representative to support Space Shuttle integrated testing and payload testing. During the early phase of building the International Space Station, Dr. Fisher was the chief of the Space Station branch. Dr. Fisher, welcome back to Italy. It's a pleasure to have you here again for our virtual programs in Italy, and I look forward to your presentation. And I'll be back to ask you the questions afterwards.
Thank you so much, Marlena. It's a real honor for me to be here with all of you this evening at the Galastica Astronomy Festival. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person due to the strange circumstances we all find ourselves in around the world. I've been learning a bit about how all of you in Italy are having to deal with COVID, and here in the United States, we're dealing with the same thing. So hopefully we will come up with vaccines and be able to get together in person again. So with that, I'm going to give you just a brief outline. What I'd like to do tonight is talk to you about my journey of how I became an astronaut. And then I'll talk a bit about what it was like to be in space and a little bit about our space program, our international space program. And then I'll go back to finish the rest of my journey of what does an astronaut do after you retire? Because I've had some interesting things, I think, to share with you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'll probably talk about 45 minutes to maybe an hour or so. I'll try to keep it under. And then we have about 30 minutes or so for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, be sure to be writing them down and get them into us. And I look forward to answering them. So with that, I'm going to get started. I always like to start with a photograph of when I was a young girl for a couple of reasons. One, so that if any young children are watching, they realize that you too were a young child, and it was a long journey getting to where I was to be selected as an astronaut, but also to talk about the fact that I was incredibly shy. I was very much a math and science nerd when I was younger. for those of you who also feel like that, if I had known that speaking in public was a requirement to be an astronaut, that would have frightened me far more than launching on the shuttle. And I also like to talk about when I first got the idea to be an astronaut. My father was in the military. We moved many places. But when I was 12 years old, I was listening to Alan Shepard, who was the first American to launch into space after Yuri Gagarin became the first human to ever launch in space. And I remember I was in school and I was listening to him, Alan Shepard, talk to Mission Control. And at that moment, I decided that that's what I want to do someday. But of course, it didn't seem like a very realistic goal. They had just started the space program. All the astronauts were men and they were all test pilots. Women were not even allowed to fly fighter jets in the military to get that experience. So it certainly didn't seem like a realistic dream, but the seed was planted. As I said, my father was in the military, and when he finally retired, we settled in San Pedro, which is in the Los Angeles area of California. So 8th grade was my 13th school when I was 13 years old. So we basically moved on average every year while I was growing up. So I was really happy that I got to attend middle school and high school in one place. Graduated from San Pedro High School in 1967, and I put a strong value on maintaining friendships with my friends from high school, probably because I traveled so much and I didn't get to stay in touch with my friends from when I was younger. I applied to the University of California at Los Angeles and was very fortunate to be accepted because it was the only university that I applied to. I started out in math, but got my bachelor's in chemistry. And after doing some research, I decided that I love math and science, but I wanted to combine my love of math and science and applied to medical school. I was very fortunate to also get into medical school at the University of California, Los Angeles, and decided to study emergency medicine. And I had not, and by this time I had kind of given up on my dream to be an astronaut. I thought perhaps I was just born too early. But I still hadn't totally given up, because in the back of my mind, I thought, well, maybe there'll be a space station someday and I could be a doctor on the space station. But it certainly didn't seem like a realistic goal. When all of a sudden, my then fiance, later husband, who was a year ahead in medical training, was having lunch with one of my medical student friends and found out that NASA was now looking for not only pilot astronauts, but mission specialist astronauts. Both of us applied. It was about a month before the deadline, and it took almost a month to get all the requirements together, your transcripts, letters of recommendation, and so forth. And I barely got mine in one day before the deadline, and then suddenly found out 6 weeks later, I was interviewing in the first group of women ever interviewed for a job. We each had to write a little essay of why I wanted to be an astronaut. And, you know, back in those days, we didn't have laptops we could take with us. So this was the little note that I wrote to the selection committee on the little tablet of paper by the phone in the hotel we were staying in. And then I was very fortunate to find out in January of 1978 that I was selected to be in the first class of astronauts ever selected for the Space Shuttle program. There were 35 of us, 15 pilots and 20 mission specialists with a variety of backgrounds. And as you can see, looking at this slide, the largest and most diverse class that NASA had ever selected. And also the first class of women selected for the United States space program. On the left, Dr. Shannon Lucid, a biochemist, Dr. Ray Seddon, a medical doctor like myself, Dr. Kathy Sullivan, a geologist, Dr. Judy Resnick, electrical engineer, and unfortunately she died in the Challenger accident. Myself and Dr. Sally Ride, who was the first American woman to fly in space. Unfortunately, she passed away from pancreatic cancer in 2012. Recently, a gentleman named Tim Gagnon designed a patch for the six of us. You can see it here on my jacket. And I like to think that both Judy and Sally would have approved of this design as well. We were not the first women to fly in space. The first two women to fly in space, one was Valentina Tereshkova for the former Soviet Union, and she flew shortly after Yuri Gagarin. And then Svetlana Stavianskaya was the second. She flew just a short time before Sally flew, and she was the first woman to do an EVA or a spacewalk. From the time my selection was announced in January till when we started, all sorts of things happened. My life really changed in an instant. One of the things that happened is I got invited to be on the cover of Red Book magazine, and all sorts of things happened being a part of that first group in the United States. But then in July, we had to move to Houston. My husband, I forgot to mention, was not selected, even though he had applied and had also been interviewed, but I was. So that was a little bit of an interesting twist to our story. But we moved to Houston in June at the Johnson Space Center, which is south of the city of Houston. And then once we started, our first day was in July. Very shortly after, they sent us to water survival training, which was a really interesting experience for all of us. There's the six of us as we finished our water survival training. And the reason that was required is because part of our training was to fly in T-38 jets. We weren't pilots, we flew in the back seat, and we were responsible for navigation and communication. And people often ask how we were accepted when we were first came to Houston. And I use this as an example. When we went to Ellington Air Force Base, which is where our T-38 fleet of T-38s is kept, the folks who did our personal equipment made each of us one of these badges, name tags to put on our flight suits. And I've always treasured mine because I think it was very special that they wanted to make us feel welcome. There's about a year or so where you do all sorts of different classes and simulators and things like that. But after that year, every person in the office gets a job. My first job was to work in the area of spacesuits. They didn't even have a space shuttle spacesuit back in those days. This is actually an Apollo suit, and Pete Conrad was the shortest of the Apollo astronauts. And so they tried to get his suit cinched down enough to where it fit me. But as you can see, it's still pretty big. It was a great way to start my career as an astronaut. This is another shot as I'm getting suited up, getting ready to go into the water tank. But then one of the other jobs I had was to work at the Kennedy Space Center. We have a group of astronauts who supports all the testing at the Kennedy Space Center and does all the configuration of the cockpit to get it ready to launch and make sure that all the switches are in the right position. This is a picture of Sally and I. I was the lead person getting ready for her flight. And what you don't realize in this picture is I'm about 7.5 months pregnant. And when I got, after Sally launched in June of 1982, I'm sorry, when I got back, I found out that I was assigned, that about 2 weeks before I delivered my daughter, that I was being assigned to my flight. But one of the neat things was that in my previous career as a doctor and in my studies at UCLA, I was used to being the only woman in most of the situations. So it was really fun to have Ray as a really good friend, because she had her son, Paul, about a year before I had my daughter, Kristen. So it was fun to share medicine, astronaut, and being moms together. So as I said, I was assigned to my flight when I got back from the Kennedy Space Center about 2 weeks before my daughter was delivered. Kristen was delivered on a Friday, and I was back at work on Monday because I wanted to be sure that everyone understood that just because I'd had a baby did not mean that I was not going to honor my commitment to going into space. But one of the neat things when you're first assigned to a flight was you get to design your patch. And Dave Walker, the pilot, and myself were the rookies on board. So our commander let us take the lead to design the patch. And so here you see the names of all of it, the last names of all of us on the outside. And then we were going to launch 2 satellites, and then we were going to be the first flight ever to bring hardware back from space. 2 satellites that were deployed from the shuttle on an earlier mission, earlier in 1984. The rocket that was supposed to take them to a higher orbit had failed. And so we were going to go up and bring those 2 satellites back. And no one had ever done anything like that before. So we have 2 satellites in the center there to represent the 2 we would deploy and the 2 we would bring back. And then 5 stars for the 5 crew members. And then since I was the first mom to fly in space and I was helping design the patch, I added a star for my daughter, Kristen. About 6 weeks before flight, you have a big press conference, and that's where the press gets to ask us all questions and take pictures. And again, because I was the first mom, they wanted to take pictures with Kristen. And so here you can see one of our crew equipment folks had made a little spacesuit for her as well. About 2 weeks before launch, 2 to 3 weeks, you go to the Kennedy Space Center for a practice launch. That's where this picture was taken. And here you see the rest of my crew, Dale Gardner, who would be one of the crew members going out to do the spacewalk, our commander, Rick Hauk, Dr. Joe Allen, who would also be going out for the spacewalk. Myself, I was the flight engineer and the robotic arm operator, and our pilot, Dave Walker. It's also the last time that the payload bay doors of the shuttle are open, so you can come up close and see your payload. Here are the 2 satellites we are going to deploy. The one in the center with the gold foil is almost identical to the 2 that are already up in space that we're going to go bring back, and they would be put in the forward portion, as you'll see in a later slide. So you go to the Kennedy Space Center about 3 days before launch. And then on the morning of launch, there's a lot of tradition. We take pictures together. This is our picture at breakfast. And here's a picture as we're getting ready to walk out to the Astrovan that will take us out to the pad. And one of the really special things for me was by this time, my husband was also selected to be an astronaut. We were the first couple ever selected. And because he was an astronaut, he was able to be at that area as we walk out. And it was really nice to know that my mom was there taking care of Kristen. And so this was my last glimpse of them before I was going to go launch into space. And it meant a great deal to me to see Kristen one more time before I launched. So I was the 4th person to ingress the vehicle. We launched on Space Shuttle Discovery, which is at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. So I got to stand out on this access arm looking at the ocean while the commander, the pilot, and Joe Allen ingressed and got strapped into their seats. So I cannot tell you what a surreal feeling it was to sit out there, stand out there, I should say, looking at the ocean. It was a full moon. And here it was all these many years later, I'm about to launch into space and fulfill that dream I had ever since I was 12 years old. It was a really surreal feeling. This is what it looks like inside the cabin. The commander sits on the upper left, the pilot the upper right, Joe Allen on the right lower part, and then I'm in the center there. And as you can see from where I'm sitting, I get a really good look at all the displays and panels, and it was my job to make sure we stayed on the timeline, and were we to have any malfunction, which thankfully we didn't, that I would make sure we were working the right procedure and stayed on the timeline. We launched on November 8th. We had a one-day delay due to the winds at altitude. And Here you have the shuttle in, whoops, sorry about that. The shuttle attached to the large orange external tank, which provides fuel to the 3 main engines, and then the 2 solid rocket boosters on either side. There's over 7 million pounds of thrust when the solid rockets ignite. I was going to show you a brief video of ascent, but there were technical difficulties, so I won't be able to show you that. But just to give you an idea of what launch on the shuttle was like, you go from 0 miles per hour or kilometers per hour to 26,500 kilometers per hour in about 8.5 minutes. During the first stage, while the solid rocket boosters are attached, there's a lot of noise, a lot of vibration. But as soon at about 2 minutes into the flight, the solid rocket boosters are jettisoned. They fall back into the ocean with parachutes and are retrieved and used for about 10 missions each. And after that, the ride is just as smooth as silk, no vibration, just a constant acceleration up until orbital velocity. And the last minute or so, you are experiencing 3 Gs, which means if you weighed, for example, 50 kilograms on the ground, for a brief period, you might weigh 150 kilograms, but it's really not very uncomfortable. And then in an instant, you go from 3 Gs to 0 Gs in literally when those main engines shut down. And you can almost feel the blood in your legs going out of your legs into your central venous system. And if you look at astronauts' faces when they first get on orbit, you'll see that they're really full. And it's really neat. It gets rid of all your wrinkles for a while, but unfortunately they come back. So I'm going to skip over this video now because we weren't able to get it to work, and I apologize. Now I'm just going to show you real briefly what it was like to live on board the shuttle and what we did. Even though the shuttle isn't flying anymore, there are many similarities to the vehicles, the current vehicles we're developing, which I'll show a little later in my presentation. So here you see our commander, Rick Hauk, sitting in his seat. And you can see that this is the flight deck. The shuttle is like a little small 2-story apartment. The upper flight deck, as you can see, looks similar in a way to a commercial jet cockpit. There are over 2,000 switches and circuit breakers. We had over 300 pounds of checklists that we carried. You see the crew activity plan in the center of the screen here, which was our Bible that told us what we were going to be doing every minute. The red stripe on it indicates it's the commanders, because red was for the commander, yellow for the pilot, green for me, mission specialist 2. And then once you get on orbit, this is the aft or back portion behind where Rick was sitting. And there were 2 seats there, as you saw in the earlier slide, but once you get on orbit, you don't need any seats because of course you're floating, and in fact, they just get in the way. So we fold them and stow them away and don't bring them back out again until just before we come back. And then on the left, there's a panel where the commander can fly the shuttle when you're going to dock with the International Space Station, or when, in our case, going to rendezvous with the satellites. And on the right side is the panel where I operated the robotic arm. And then below on the mid-deck is where everything else takes place, you know, all the habitability, all the any scientific experiments that you carried with you. I'm holding onto the handle of our treadmill for exercise. We each had a locker. You can see my locker there. And you can tell it's mine by the green tag. And they allowed us to fly photographs and stickers from where we went to school or your military affiliation. You can see that I'm demonstrating space hair here because everything floats, including your hair. And if you go online, you can see some of the other female astronauts that had longer hair talk to you about how to wash your hair and take care of it in an orbit. It's you definitely don't have any flat hair days. A little bit about the food on orbit. The food is very much like backpacking food, and it's pretty good. But I didn't really eat anything for about 2 days. About 50 to 60% of astronauts and cosmonauts have space adaptation syndrome, which is really just a fancy term for the same symptoms as being seasick. And if you've ever thrown up on the ground, I can assure you that, and you know how unpleasant that is, that it's way more unpleasant on orbit. And I didn't want to have that happen. So I basically didn't eat anything until the morning of the third day when I felt great and I had a hot dog and it was delicious. And then we, of course, when you're trying to eat on orbit, it's really hard to juggle all these containers. So we have these trays where the little containers fit on. This is a breakfast. You can see there's coffee and orange juice and a straw with a little valve on it so that the liquid doesn't escape. A little bit about sleeping in space. On the shuttle, we really didn't have sleep compartments like they have on the International Space Station. Each crew member on the space station has a little sleep station about the size of a phone booth. But on the shuttle, we didn't have that. And I made myself this little hammocky arrangement that's sort of putting myself between two sleeping bags. None of my crewmates really wanted to use their sleeping bags and get inside them the way they're designed. So I just created this little arrangement that made me feel secure. And it was really great once you got used to it. And this is a picture my crewmate Joe Allen took about on our 8th day as we were packing up to go home. I'm actually taking a little power nap after our very busy flight. And you can see all that's holding me is this little tether holding me to the handle of the treadmill, and I'm fast asleep, just floating freely. Everybody wants to know how you go to the bathroom in space, and so I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. Here's my crewmate, Dave Walker. Hopefully he's just simulating. And this is the waste management system, which looks kind of like one of those porta potties that you would see at a festival or a marathon, something like that, a race. And we use vacuum suction to help things along. And I think I'll leave the rest to your imagination. We added NASA added a privacy curtain when we started flying mixed crews, male-female crews. But as you can see, you don't have a lot of privacy. And when I show you some of the vehicles we're now designing, they're even smaller than the shuttle. So if any of you are interested in being an astronaut, one thing you don't get a lot of is privacy. You get to know your crewmates very well, perhaps better than you really want to sometimes. So real briefly, this is what we did on our flight. On day 2 and day 3, we launched the 2 satellites that I showed you in the earlier slide. Day 4 was a preparation day for day 5 and 7, when we are going to rendezvous or join up with the 2 satellites to try to capture them and put them in the payload bay. So Joe and Dale were checking out their suits. Rick and I were getting ready to do the rendezvous. And then on day 5 and on day 7, we joined up with the satellite that you see here on the upper left, and I'm operating the robotic arm. Joe and Dale get into their spacesuits with their backpack, and they're not attached to the shuttle. Once you're in that backpack, it would be very dangerous if one of the jets failed on and you had a tether. So he's flying untethered over to the satellite, and he's going to dock with it. You can see he's docked with the back or the aft end of the satellite. I've maneuvered Joe on the end of the arms. There's some special foot restraints, and he's going to hold on to the satellite. And then Dale is going to undock and fly back into the payload bay. And then we put both of the satellites into the special hardware to hold them in the payload bay. And then they brought a little for sale sign along, hopefully anticipating that we would be successful as kind of a joke. But it's not really a joke, because these satellites were worth millions of dollars. And the insurer underwriters were they were the ones who wanted this mission. And then they were able to have the satellites refurbished, and they were launched later and served their useful lifetime up in orbit. During the spacewalks, our families get to go to mission control to a viewing room behind it. And this was a picture that they took of Kristen watching as we were doing the spacewalks. Then we took our crew photograph on orbit. Every crew has a photograph that they take on orbit. And then on the morning of the 9th day, we did our deorbit burn, which what that does is you slow down the shuttle velocity to under the orbital velocity. And basically at that point, you become a meteor entering the Earth's atmosphere, experiencing temperatures at the leading edge of the wings and the nose of up to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a picture that a friend of mine took as we went overhead Houston. And then we were the second shuttle to land at the Kennedy Space Center. And to give you an idea of how fast we're traveling, the photograph in the previous slide over Houston to landing at the Kennedy Space Center was about 4 minutes. Normally, if you're flying in a commercial jet, that's about an 1.5 to 2 hour flight. So just to give you an idea, we were also, as I mentioned, the first flight ever to bring hardware back. And we were met by custom officials asking if we had anything to declare. And here you see, as we're I remember when we landed, I felt like a 300-kilogram gorilla or something. It was, I felt incredibly heavy and very unsteady. You can see we're all holding on to the railing very carefully because none of us wanted to fall as we were exiting the shuttle. At that point, they took us over to the crew quarters that you saw on the earlier slide where we were having breakfast. We took a shower. We landed at about 7 or 7:30 in the morning. At about 1:30, we were in a NASA jet flying back to Houston. And by about 2 to 3 in the afternoon, we were back home in Houston. And I can't tell you how happy I was to see my little girl. We were apart for about 15 days. And that was the longest I had been separated from her. So it was just great to see her. I'd like to switch gears now and excuse me, and show you a bit about what that tremendous view from space looks like. Excuse me one second. And talk about the amazing view from space. Every photographer tries to capture the perfect sunrise or sunset, and it takes about 90 minutes to go around the Earth. So every 45 minutes, you're seeing either a sunrise or a sunset, and you never get tired of them. They're just so incredibly beautiful. This is the Aurora Borealis. This is looking into the Mediterranean, Straits of Gibraltar. This is looking into the Sinai Peninsula, and one of the things you will hear every astronaut and cosmonaut and taikonaut, which is what the Chinese call their astronauts, talk about that from space you don't see borders. You just see this one beautiful planet. And particularly when you look at this area of the world that has had so much violence and bloodshed for thousands of years, it just makes you sad because you just realize that there's this one beautiful planet. And then if you turn around and look out into space, there's this vast blackness. And at least in many of our lifetime, it's going to be a long time before we can leave our solar system to find perhaps another habitable planet. So we really need to learn to get along and take care of this amazing planet of ours. As we have more chances for non-astronauts and tourists to go into space, we are all hoping that maybe the more people that get to see this view, the more united we'll all feel. These are the Himalayas. And then the daytime views are amazing, but the views I liked the most that were spectacular were the nighttime views. One of my colleagues said that the cities at night are the beautiful unintended consequence of civilization, and I certainly agree with his sentiment. This is Tokyo and Tokyo Harbor and the Nile Delta, and Africa truly is the dark continent because at night the only lights you really see are along the Nile, along the coast, and then with lightning jumping from the different thunderstorms, traveling hundreds of miles. I never got tired of watching those thunderstorms. unlike the United States, which is lit up like a Christmas tree, here you see the outline of Florida looking up the East Coast and the full moon shining on the Atlantic Ocean. This is Los Angeles, where I can almost find my home where I grew up when I look at that. And this is Houston with the Johnson Space Center in the center. And then this is the Kennedy Space Center with the vertical assembly building and the 2 launch pads and the runway that we would land on. And again, to go from the West Coast to the East Coast of the United States takes about 8 to 8.5 minutes, just to give you an idea. Normally it would take 4.5 to 5 hours to fly commercially, just again to give you an idea of how fast orbital velocity is. And then last, just wanted to show you this picture of Europe with the cities labeled, so I don't have to remember which one is which. And then this is, I did not put this slide in just because I'm talking to folks in Italy. It's one of my favorite photographs from space. I just think it's an incredibly beautiful photograph of Italy. I just want to stop for just a second to remind you of some of your own astronauts. Italy has actually quite a few astronauts, and I don't have all of them here, but Roberto Vittori, Paolo Nespoli, Luca Parmitano, who is the astronaut that had that very close call with water entering his helmet during his spacewalk. If you ever get a chance to hear him talk about it, it's a really exciting story, and he handled it really well in a very dangerous situation. And then Samantha Cristoforetti. So, and there are a few others who've flown, and so you really have a fair number of astronauts, quite a few astronauts from Italy yourself. So I'd like to shift gears again and just very briefly show you a bit about our astronaut training. Here you see 2 of my colleagues in one of our simulators. We had 2. One was a motion-based for ascent entry training, and then we had a fixed base for orbit training. And then, of course, there are a lot of other wonderful jobs in the space program. There's engineers, flight controllers, doctors, researchers. There's many, many ways to get involved, but it's very important. Not only does the crew have to be trained, but all those flight controllers. So we often had to do simulations together. And then we finally had our first female flight director, who's the flight director is the boss of mission control. We didn't have although we were selected in 1978, we didn't have the first female flight director, Michelle Brecky, until 1984. And then we have a full-scale mock-up of the International Space Station where all the expedition crews do their training, and we have cruise astronauts coming from all over the world to train there. And then we have this large pool where we do all the training for spacewalks. And here you see one of the astronauts on this platform. There's one astronaut on each side, and it's lowered into the water. You can see they have lead weights around their legs, and then the divers put them on the arms once they get in the water to try to make you neutrally buoyant. But physically, this is the hardest training, certainly the hardest training for me, but for all astronauts. Physically, it's very hard and difficult. And then once you're in the water and wade out, you go through your procedures. And we also use that pool to practice our procedures in case you had to eject from a T-38 or had to bail out from the shuttle, learn how to get into your raft and all those sorts of things. And that is, and then the other part of our training is we have a small fleet of T-38s, like I've mentioned. This is how the pilots maintain their proficiency as pilots. But for the mission specialists like myself, we fly in the back seat, and we are responsible for the communication and navigation. And it is a really valuable part of our training because it puts you in an environment where it truly can be hazardous, whereas all of our other training is in simulators. So that's just a brief summary. When we were doing, when our class was selected, of course, we didn't have iPhones, so we weren't always taking pictures and selfies and so forth. But one of my last times flying in the T-38, I happened to have my iPhone with me. So this is a selfie I took while I was flying in the T-38. Real briefly, just want to tell you a bit about what's currently happening in the program. I was chief of the space station branch at the very early phases when we first launched the very first piece, Node 1 in December of 1998. And it is truly, I think, one of the most complicated and amazing things that humans has ever done. We have had continuous this slide's a little old. The first humans on board the space station were in October of 2000. So we are now, at the end of this month, going to be 20 years of continuous manned presence, or people presence, I should say. We're up to a crew of 6 with many countries participating. And I think it just shows what we can do when we're cooperating internationally. It's just an amazing feat. Shot that the shuttle took as it was backing away from the station to return back to Earth. And it truly is an amazing structure. The shuttle stopped flying in July of 2011. There were 100, it flew for 30 years, 135 flights. It was one of my favorite shots of the shuttle on the pad at sunset. After that, for many years, we had to rely on our Russian colleagues to launch on the Soyuz. That's one of the reasons all the new astronauts have to learn Russian, and they have to learn Russian to a fairly high level of proficiency. And they launched out of Baikonur, and we had to pay $70 million a seat for each astronaut that flew on board the Soyuz. This is the most recent class of astronauts. There are 12 that were selected. I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, and there were 18,000 applicants for those 12 spots. And I know ESA, the European Space Agency, also had a selection and has their own selection process. And then they come and train in the United States, as does the Canadian and Japanese partners. About 2 years ago on International Women's Day, all the women that were actively in the office took this picture, and Peggy Whitson was the commander on board the International Space Station at that time. And since the 6 of us were selected, we've had over about 60 women have flown in space. So we've really made tremendous progress. And just a few months ago, Jessica Meir and Christina Koch did the first all-female spacewalk, and they did several of those. And the Capcom was Stephanie Wilson, who's also an active astronaut in the United States right now. So it was truly amazing how far we've come. So real briefly, what is happening now in the United States? We have the Commercial Crew Program, and we have SpaceX with Elon Musk developing the Crew Dragon. I'm sure many of you saw the first manned launch last May, and Boeing is developing the Starliner capsule. The purpose of these 2 vehicles is to take humans to the International Space Station, so we no longer have to rely on the Russian Soyuz to get astronauts, US astronauts. These are the first 2 crews that were announced for the SpaceX and Boeing flights. And as I mentioned, the DM2 mission, the first manned launch of the SpaceX Dragon, happened last May. It was Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken launched from the Kennedy Space Center on a Falcon rocket. And here's the rocket with the capsule out on the pad. It launches from the same pad that the shuttle used to launch from. And here is their launch last May. And here's the Dragon attached to the space station where the shuttle used to dock. And crew on board the space station and stayed up for several months and only returned a couple months ago. And here they are, the first crew, I believe, to land in the Gulf because there was a storm in the Atlantic, but perfect landing. And now they're getting ready for the second mission. This is the Crew 1 mission with our Japanese colleagues, and there'll be 4 people on that mission, which is scheduled at the moment for October 31st, just a few weeks away. And here they are sitting in the Dragon. Boeing was hoping to do their first manned launch this year, but they had a problem with their unmanned launch last December. The ascent and the entry were perfect, but there was a few problems. So they've decided that they want to redo have a second unmanned launch. So they're trying to get that done before the end of this year. And then hopefully we'll have their first manned launch sometime next year. And here you see the crew of that mission that will take place next year. And here they're launching on an Atlas rocket, also at the Kennedy Space Center. And this is the launch, what it will look like, but this is the launch of the unmanned launch that I told you about that happened last December. So that is what the commercial crew program is working on. And then what NASA is working on is the Orion vehicle, which is being designed not to go into low Earth orbit, not to go to the International Space Station, but to go beyond low Earth orbit, back to the moon or for our next projects. This is a drawing of the Orion capsule. And the good thing about all 3 of these vehicles is they all have abort systems, which the Shuttle did not have. And so in this next slide, this is a test of the abort system, and it was totally successful for the Orion vehicle. And the first unmanned launch of the Orion vehicle is hopefully going to take place sometime next year. I worked on the Orion vehicle. We were developing the displays. One of the last things I worked on before I retired. So here, just to keep them straight, here's mock-ups of all 3 vehicles. This is the SpaceX Dragon, the Boeing Starliner, and the Orion capsule. And as you can see, they all look relatively similar, but these 2 are to go to the International Space Station, and Orion is to go beyond low Earth orbit. And what President Trump announced is that he wanted us to build a base on the moon and hopes to have humans back on the moon by 2024. Of course, as you may be aware, we're in the midst of a re-election campaign now, so it remains to be seen what will happen. But hopefully, no matter who's elected, we will continue on this path, with the ultimate goal being to go to Mars. This is just a neat shot from one of the Mars rovers that I love, because to me it looks like it could be someplace here on Earth. And then just to remind everyone just what a difficult thing we're talking about, this is a picture of Earth taken from the Mars rover, just to give you a visual representation of just how far away Mars is, which is why I think it's very important to go to the moon first, learn to live on another body while you're 3 or 4 days from home, rather than several months to years away. So real quickly now, I would just like to continue my personal story of what happened after I flew on my space shuttle mission. My then husband flew about a year after I did and did a spacewalk. And you see, again, we were doing an appearance somewhere together as a family. And then the Challenger accident happened in January of 1986. And my husband and I decided we wanted to have our second child. And I wound up taking a 7-year leave of absence. This is an award I was given on Mother's Day, the Mother's Day after I flew in space, so Mother's Day of 1985. It was given to various mothers. One of the other ladies was one of the first female governor of Kentucky, and several actresses like Susan Lucci. So then after I took a 7-year leave of absence, I always found it somewhat ironic that when I stayed home, I didn't get any awards, but when I was gone for a long time, I got a Mother of the Year award. But it was very useful when my daughters complained about me being, you know, the worst mom. I could bring out this award and show them. So we had our second daughter, and it was really, I think, fun on Take Your Daughters to Work Day. I'm not sure if you have that in Italy, but it's a big thing that we did. And it was a really fun experience for both of them. When they went away to college, I was constantly they took everything for granted when they were younger, but then when they went to college, they would come home and ask if they could bring friends and get tours of the Space Center. So it was kind of fun. The daughter that was my daughter that was the baby when I flew, Kristen, is now a White House correspondent for Fox Network News. She had her first child, my first grandchild, a couple of years ago. She'll be turning 3 in December, and I'm already trying to get her indoctrinated to be an astronaut. She had her first flight jacket and now her first flight suit. I'm reading to her all these books like Organic Chemistry for Babies and How Rockets Work and so forth, and she really seems interested. And I even spoke at her preschool class and about, it was very difficult talking to a class of 2- and 3-year-olds. And then this is Kristen. Just the other day, she was at the White House reporting as President Trump was leaving with the diagnosis of COVID to go to Walter Reed Hospital. So she has a very demanding career also. My younger daughter was pursuing a career in business, and she just was married. She's going on 2 years now, and getting my second grandson due in March, one of the fringe benefits of quarantine and COVID. So things are progressing. I retired in April of 2017. This is Chris Cassidy, who is currently on board the International Space Station, was chief of the office, and giving me my plaque that we all get when we retired. And as an aside, you see Paolo Nespoli in the lower right-hand corner, just coincidentally in this picture. And one of the first things I did when I retired was I went on a Viking cruise with some of my high school friends. I mentioned that we've all stayed very close, and they had a cake made for me for my retirement. And when I got back from that cruise, and this is some of my high school friends when we were in Venice as part of that cruise. And when I got back from that trip, I was contacted by Viking asking if I'd be the godmother of their next ship. And they gave me the opportunity to name it. So I actually named it the Viking Orion. And when we went on the shakedown cruise, which is kind of like a test flight, we went from Rome to Barcelona, and I got to invite lots of my friends. So actually, retirement has also been fun to continue the relationship with other industries. This was the night of the naming ceremony I had to write it down so that I could remember, in Livorno, which was where, and they actually had a cardinal from the Vatican come to bless the ship. A big fireworks display that night after the naming ceremony, which was absolutely amazing. Other things I've been doing, I've been speaking at the Kennedy Space Center Visitors Complex and Space Center Houston, which is the Visitors Complex. And also I was asked to give a commencement address at the University of California, Los Angeles, the largest audience that I've ever spoken to. So I guess I've gotten over those nervousness that I mentioned from when I was a very young child. And then I've been doing things like this for the State Department. I've been to many places. This is a picture taken in St. Petersburg when I had a trip to Moscow and St. Petersburg for the United States State Department. And I've had really a wonderful experience getting to talk about space and young children pursuing careers in STEM and encouraging women to pursue careers in STEM field. So it's been just a really amazing experience. Another picture when I was in St. Petersburg. And so with that, I think I'm going to stop talking, and I'd like to end with this slide. I just love this painting that someone did for NASA. My grandmother passed away in 2003 at the age of 105. She was born in 1898, and I cannot believe, that she was born in the horse and buggy days and saw the development of the automobile and commercial aviation, to seeing the first man walk on the moon, to seeing her granddaughter launch into space. So with the way technology is changing and everything, I just think it's such an amazing time, and I encourage all of you that are students to follow your passion, follow your dreams. Even if you live to be 105, it's still a relatively short time. So really find something you're passionate about and enjoy it. And I wish you all good luck, and thank you so much. I'll be happy to take questions now.
Okay, wow, Dr. Fisher, that was an amazing journey that you just took us on. Thank you so much for that presentation. And I have to say that I think you should also get the Outstanding Grandmother Award, even if it's just for the cute outfits that you put on the babies, in addition to reading them books about, what was it, quantum physics or organic chemistry for babies?
And that's a real book, by the way. It's not a joke. I saw that and I said, I have to have that.
I can see why. I wanted to ask you a fangirl question first before we go to our questions from our viewers. There's a new Netflix series called Away, and it's actually based on a woman who's an astronaut going on the first manned mission to Mars. And she's married to an astronaut and has a baby daughter and is torn about leaving her for so long to go to Mars. It sounds a little bit like your life. Maybe 50 years later.
Watched all 10 episodes. I absolutely loved it. I mean, there were a few things, 1 minute they're floating, the next minute they're sitting, or standing or walking, little things like that. But I think it actually, Hilary Swank, I saw posted on Facebook that she had visited the Space Center and had talked with a lot of the astronauts. And I think she and the other actors were trying to really portray how difficult that would be. And I think certainly there was a lot of drama, but I think it did a fairly good job of representing the kinds of issues that you could encounter. And I loved it.
That's great. Next thing on my binge watch list. So one question from our viewers is, we consider being an astronaut a very dangerous job. How do astronauts feel about fear?
Well, when you're sitting out on the pad with basically a bomb on a bomb, if somebody tells you they're not scared, they are probably lying to you. We're well trained, but we understand the risks. I think one of the neatest things about all three vehicles that I showed you is that they all have abort systems. And that one slide I showed you showed that the abort system worked. And the other vehicles are tested too. So that is a real big step forward, because once you pull the capsule away from the rocket, then the parachute comes out. I mean, you may not be where you want to be over the Earth. You might be somewhere other than you intended, but you're alive. And the shuttle didn't have that capability. So I can honestly say, when you look at the history of the Soyuz rocket, which is similar to the three that I showed you, I would get on a Soyuz rocket tomorrow. And I mean, I'd still be a little apprehensive, but I don't think I'd be as scared as I would on the shuttle, where you really don't have that capability. The Russians had one aboard on the pad. Both astronauts walked away from that. They had one aboard just recently, I think about a year and a half ago, at about 2 minutes into the flight. Again, a successful abort. The crew was brought back, and then they put them back in the rotation. And then they had one early in their program. They had a very late abort where they the rescue crews took 3 days to find them. Couldn't even find, because it was early in the program. But so they've had 3 aborts that worked successfully. So yes, I mean, it's never going to be totally without risk, but that's why we went back to the capsule concept, because it does enhance the crew's ability to survive.
So in addition to having to be very brave and very prepared and use good judgment, there must be a huge component in there as well about your physical condition and being prepared in that way. What kind of physical toll does it take on your body, and how do you prepare for that?
You know, when we were selected, there wasn't the emphasis that there is now. I mean, you were supposed to be in good shape, but it was left up to you. Now it's much more, NASA is much more active in requiring you to be in good condition, taking a physical fitness, as part of your physical, you take a physical fitness test. We have special trainers that teach you workout regimes for you, for how to get your cardiovascular and resistive training in. As I mentioned in my talk, physically the hardest thing is the training in the spacesuit. That is, I mean, some of the most difficult things I've ever done was when I was in that suit training in the water. And we have a lot of astronauts that have shoulder rotator cuff injuries as a result of that. But you just, you know, we have very good trainers who work with us and try to develop the muscles so that you are prepared for it. And again, I can't stress, training and preparation is key for everything. And that is one thing NASA is really good at.
Great. Well, let's go back to our viewer questions. Regarding the International Space Station, the program will probably end in the year 2024. What does this mean specifically? And would it be best to avoid destroying the space station?
I certainly hope it won't be destroyed. I mean, it is working very well. The Mir space station far exceeded its design lifetime. I mean, it lasted way longer than it was designed for. And with people up there doing maintenance and everything, there's no reason to doubt that the space station will. I think what people are talking about is handing it over to some private entity. I don't know whether a private company or some consortium of companies. I think all that is under discussion, but I truly hope that there'll be some mechanism to keep the station up there. I can't imagine that anyone is going to allow it to end any sooner than unless it has a major failure of some sort. To not keep a functioning, amazing facility like this operating for as long as possible would be a real tragedy, I think.
So I noticed when you showed some photos of the cockpit that there were so many papers and a hard copy of the crew activity plan, just papers stuck everywhere. How long ago did that disappear, and what was it replaced with?
You know, it's really interesting because, you know, when I was chief of the space station branch, the person who was in charge of all of our checklists immediately said, we are going to go to a laptop, you know, type of a situation where we can't update procedures and all that sort of stuff. So, but I knew that most pilots of that era were used to having a physical checklist. And so I still remember, I have to smile, the first meeting we had with the first flight director for the Expedition 1 crew, when he found out that they were going to go to a computerized checklist rather than hard copy. Immediately they said, no, we want books. And so the first 2 expeditions had books, but they quickly learned what we all knew was going to happen was that it was impossible to keep checklists up to date. And without having a computer, you would spend all your time updating checklists and stuff. So they quickly, starting with Expedition 3, went to, a computerized checklist, and we went away from that very quickly. We still have a few books for some simple things, like if you lost all your computers, how do you recover them? And so a few very major things like that. But literally, like I said, we carried 300 pounds of checklists. What was really interesting too was I was a Capcom in mission control as one of my jobs. And it was the same thing. We had all those books on console because we had to have everything the crew had. We had all of our handover notes were written notes. And when I came back years later after my leave of absence and everything, and I was a Capcom for the space station, it was totally different. Everything, again, was computerized and so forth. So it was a totally different, both for on board and in mission control.
Progress. Okay, let's go back to our questions. Here's another one. We're hearing a lot about a date for a return trip to the moon. Is it possible to return to the moon maybe in a couple of years? And what would be the role of private space industries?
Well, I have no doubt that we can return to the moon. I mean, when we went to the moon the first time, the computers we had back then, I think 64K was the memory of these computers. We have so much more capability now. So I have no doubt whatsoever. I feel very confident that we could meet President Trump's desire to have us be on the moon by 2024 and build a base on the moon. So I have no doubt that we can technically do that. It's a matter of the political will and the political desire of everyone to do that. The issue of private companies going to the moon, that gets a little, that's a slight, I'm not sure how that is all going to work out. And it's going to be very interesting to see if the United Nations and all of that starts to get involved in those kinds of decisions. At the moment, it's really, I think, like the Wild West. Anybody who has the capability to get up there can go. So exactly, I think it's kind of fun in a way to look at a future where, now that in the past, nobody had the capability to do anything like that other than governments. And now we see the Elon Musks of the world and so forth. So, and plus we have the other nations, I'm sure China will have the capability. So the Soviets as well. So the Russians as well. So it'll be very interesting to see how all that plays out in the future. And I'm really not certain how it's all going to work out.
Okay. One of our staff asked a question. If you could add a module to the International Space Station, how would you design it and what would you put inside?
How would I design it? Well, I never thought about that one. I'll have to think about it. It would be really nice. Basically, when the original design for the space station had a lab module and a habitability module. And the minute the budget got to be a problem, well, the first thing to go was the habitability module. And so early on, if you followed all the different iterations, the POTI, the waste management system, had to actually be in one corner of the lab for a while. Finally, they brought node 2 up, and basically they turned the combination of node 2, and then they added a node 3 to node 2, and that's where the exercise equipment is, the resistive training and the treadmill are, the sleep compartments are in node 2. So what I would do is go back and add a habitability module as we originally envisioned, place for the crew to to go sleep and work together, and to relax together, a place to have your meals, a place to sleep, and have that all contained in one module. But whenever you're in a program where the budget becomes an issue, the first thing to go is the frills, or what is perceived to be frills. And that's fine when you're talking like on a shuttle flight for 8 days or whatever, you can put up with anything, or 2 weeks. When you're talking about being in space for 6 months to a year, those frills are not really frills anymore. Those are the things that give you the ability to do something that is very difficult. I'm blanking on the title of Scott Kelly's book. I'll have to think about it in a moment. But he flew a shuttle mission, a 6-month station mission, and a 1-year mission in his book, his autobiography. And I don't generally recommend books, but it is very insightful. I learned a lot from his book of how much more difficult 6 months was than a shuttle flight, and but that was still doable. But 1 year was very difficult. And
that sounds like a little bit more than the difference between camping and glamping, as we call it, glamour camping.
There's really no glamping in space at the moment. I guess that's going to be up to Elon Musk to do that. Saw his really jazzy spacesuits there, so maybe he'll develop the glamping modules to add to the space station.
Okay, here's another question from our viewers. The Galactica theme in this year is space and humanity. What do you think space could do, or space exploration can do, for the future of humanity, specifically regarding the pandemic, the pandemic?
Well, I've always felt that humans' destiny is exploration. I mean, if you go back to the very beginning of how humans developed and how they slowly migrated all over the earth, and then you look at the Columbus and all the early explorers going on the ocean to discover the new world, and then in the United States, settling on the East Coast and going west. There are just always this subset of people that love to explore. It's just almost like in their DNA. And I think that's having to do with survival of the species. And here you look at the pandemic. There's, I don't think this virus is deadly to the extent that it would wipe out human civilization, but you could conceive of a virus or bacteria or something that could come along that could wipe out the human population, or a lot of it. And that's one of the reasons that I feel that space exploration is so vital to our survival as a species. And it doesn't have to just be a pandemic. It could be like what happened with the dinosaurs and an asteroid, or, there are many different factors that could cause the human population to become extinct. So to have the ability to live on another body, or to go to Mars and perhaps be able to make Mars a habitable planet someday, those are keys to survival. Because if you look back in history, those kinds of things can happen. So that's what I feel. And I think that maybe the pandemic is like a wake-up call to all of us to, I think a lot of times people just thought, well, some people are just worry too much about things, and it is important to worry about those things if we want to survive as a species. Maybe not this year, next year, maybe not for 100 years, who knows, but to have the capability to go beyond our planet to somewhere else, if we want to ensure our survival in the big picture, is what I think is important.
Okay, I wanted to mention, someone looked it up and said the book that you mentioned by Mark Kelly is Endurance, My Year in Space.
Yeah, Endurance, that's right. And
okay.
it's a really good book, really, really good book.
Okay, here's another question. What is your perception about the gender gap in STEM fields, that's science, technology, engineering, and math? What could we do better to reach an actual level of equality in that field?
You know, I don't feel that there is not equality in STEM fields. When I was starting out, there definitely was. You know, it was before, you know, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, our Supreme Court Justice, who really pushed for equality for women and every type of person. And I do think now that the opportunities are there. Even when I was in the chemistry department at UCLA in the early 70s, I felt that they didn't care what your gender was, what your sexual preference was, what your skin color was. As long as you loved chemistry and you wanted to work hard, you were encouraged. But they were kind of unique at that early time. But I think now it's a slightly different situation. I think the opportunities in STEM fields are in the United States. Now, from traveling around, I don't think that is true in every country. But in the United States, I think the opportunity is there. It's getting young girls to be excited by a career in science. I think that for some young girls, it perhaps, you know, you have the picture of an Einstein or somebody who, you know, they're the people they admire, you know, like the Kardashians and things like that sort of person is often in making is probably perceived that in science you don't make as much money as you might say in business or entertainment and so forth. So getting young girls to realize that you can be very feminine and be good in a STEM field. But as I say that, I remember one of the first things I did when I was selected as an astronaut was I went out and I bought a pair of khaki pants and shirts because I wanted to look just like the guys. I didn't want to draw any attention to myself. Now the women astronauts feel very comfortable with being feminine and being tough. You know, you cannot deny that Jessica Muir and Christina Koch doing their spacewalks, which is really hard, as I've alluded to, and yet if you see them dressed up to go out to a formal function, I think most people would think they both are very beautiful too, and you know, and stylish. So I think now the opportunity is there. It's getting young girls to realize that science is fun and it's exciting.
And you know, Dr. Fisher, so many careers are like that. When I became a Foreign Service officer, what did I do but bought a pinstripe suit so I could match the men? And now I'm in my flowered shirt. So here we are.
I must say that whenever my daughter appears on TV with, you know, something that shouldn't have a suit jacket on, I go, well, we should have a suit jacket on. It makes it a little, and then I go, what am I saying? And she goes, oh, Mom.
Right. Okay, we have a question from Simone Bella. He asked on Facebook, what kind of experiments did you perform in space?
You know, on my particular flight, we did not do a lot of science because our entire flight was like an experiment, because nobody had ever done that before. The satellites were lost in February of 1984, and we flew in November of 1984. That is a very short time to develop something totally new. We had to figure out, these satellites weren't designed to be retrieved. They had solar arrays all the way around them, and if you destroyed the solar arrays, well, there's really not much point in bringing them back because that's integral to the design and the functioning of them. So, and they didn't even start thinking about a retrieval mission for a couple of months. So it really took everything we had. We were part of not just being trained, we were part of the development effort. I would sometimes at night, I would carry Kristen in a little container, you know, little baby seat, put her on the floor while I was working with my robotic flight controller and trainer to come up with some of the procedures, because we just didn't have time to let them go off, design everything, and then come back and train me how to do it. And we were all working together, which I thought was so much fun. I loved it. But so it was really in itself, the whole flight was an experiment. I had one little experiment that it was basically a self-contained experiment looking at the development of some compounds. Basically, I turned the switch on, and just before we re-entered, I turned the switch off. So I cannot claim that I did a great deal of science in that sense. But on the International Space Station, I mean, if you just go to the NASA website, they do thousands of experiments on a 6-month increment, hundreds for each crew person. And for example, Kate Rubins, who's about to launch up to the space station for her second expedition, she was the first to sequence a genome in space. So they're doing amazing things right now. But in the early days, just proving that the shuttle worked and that we could do these, I mean, the things that that satellite, you can't really tell it in the slides, how big it is. Handling that kind of stuff kind of laid the groundwork for building the International Space Station, giving us the confidence that we could build this gigantic structure. So in a way, you could say that was the whole flight really was an experiment.
Okay, we have another question on Facebook about asteroids. Are there projects for extracting minerals from asteroids? And what do you think about that process or that idea?
You know, I know more about the committee that the society, astronautic society that we have does with the United Nations to detect asteroids, again, worrying about one coming too close to Earth and how all the countries would work together in case something like that happened. I certainly think mining an asteroid is definitely possible. And I think it's very interesting and to see if the types of compounds that we got from an asteroid would be different than things we have here on our Earth. I would imagine they would be. But I guess right now, I would rather see the effort go into building a base on the moon and then look at mining on the moon and just put our focus there rather than being scattered on a lot of different projects, since we don't have unlimited financial resources. But I certainly think it's possible, and I'm sure some enterprising entrepreneur someday will figure out how to do that.
Okay, I think we have one last question here from Romina Antonelli on Facebook. She asks, what were your deepest emotions and sensations that you felt in space?
Well, let's see. The first emotion just started at the beginning was, you know, as you sit in the cockpit and the clock goes inside 30 seconds, you just kind of, at that point, you know, you're along for the ride, you know, so you think about your family and so forth. And then I'm just focused on business, you know. You try to control those things that you can control and don't worry about things that you have no control over. So I remember an intense sense of relief at 8.5 minutes when those main engines shut down. It was like, after that, there was absolutely no fear, because by that time we had already, I thought entry was dangerous, but you know, the Columbia accident didn't happen until 2003. So I think we all got a little bit overconfident. So I can honestly say that once the main engine shut off, I thought that the riskiest part of the mission was over. Now the risk was in mission failure. But then, you know, so well, the thing I remember most is the technical part of the flight lying in contrast with your emotions as you look out the window. Every night we would take about an hour after we said goodnight to mission control and just look out the window and just seeing that amazing planet of ours as it went by. And we had Sony Walkmans instead of iPhones or iPods or whatever, and listening to music and just the surreal experience. You'd have to pinch yourself that I really am here. I really am in space. You know, it's just such a unreal experience that I remember feeling like the luckiest person in the world. And you know, there was a lot of sacrifice along the way to get there. And I remember my first comment to my husband when I landed. First thing I said to him is, it was all worth it. You know, the risk I took in leaving Kristen, all the hard work along the way, medical school, everything, it was worth it. It just, space is an amazingly wonderful place. And it really does make you feel more connected to everyone on Earth. It really, you start to, you know, you respect the fact that you're from the United States and the United States gave me the opportunity, but you also start to feel that connection with the rest of the world. And then when I later worked on the space station with all our international partners, that really solidified that sense of being part of this world rather just than any one nation. I don't know if that answers your question, but it was just amazing, a lot of amazing emotions.
I think it sure does answer the question. And really, I could listen to you forever and over about these wonderful stories. And I so appreciate you taking the time to talk to our Italian audiences again and to be part of this Galastica Astronomy Festival. And I've told you before that when we do get to travel back and forth and we do get to bring you over to Italy in person, you will have such a following. It'll be like a rock concert, I'm sure. So thank you again for joining us. This was just so wonderful.
Thanks to all of you. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. I would go today. I'm not worried about going. I'm just afraid that the U.S. would not let me back in.
Yeah, that's the problem. So I guess we'll go to Molicella, and she can close the program. And so great to be here and so great to support this wonderful festival.
Thank you, and thank you, Anna, for. I'm very glad to host you. It's a very, very important message for Italian people, and good luck for any question and for each question. And thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, and I hope I get to meet you in person one of these days when this whole craziness is over.
Thank you. And io saluto tutto il pubblico di Galastica e vi aspetto insomma domani. Anna Fischer è stata davvero meravigliosa con tutti noi. Domani avremo un altro ospite che è Paolo Bellutta dal GPL sempre di Houston. Quest'anno abbiamo questo gemellaggio, quindi ci vediamo domani. Ringrazio Marlene Nice per il lavoro e tutto lo staff dell'ambasciata americana che è stato davvero gentilissimo con tutti i contatti che avete movimentato. Insomma, siete state davvero grandissime. Grazie ancora e buona serata, buonanotte. Arrivederci.
Good
Good night.
night.